Okay, so today we are jumping into the reign of King Henry II, the founder of the really powerful Plantagenet Dynasty.
And if you really want to understand why governance and law in the Western world look the way they do now,
You have to start with him.
you absolutely do. I mean, his dynasty ruled England for over 300 years.
Yeah, but it's the foundational stuff he did, that sheer administrative machine he built that made all of that possible.
Exactly. Before we even get to the immense territory he controlled, we should probably touch on the name itself, Plantagenet.
Oh, I love this origin story. It's so wonderfully specific.
It is, isn't it? It comes from the Latin name for the yellow broom plant, Plantagenista.
And Henry's father, Geoffrey of Anjou, he was known for wearing a little sprig of it in his hat. It was their family symbol.
Kind of a humble symbol for a dynasty that would become anything but humble.
That's for sure.
And that symbol came to represent just a staggering amount of power. I mean, Henry II was one of the most demanding leaders of the whole medieval period. He was famous for just being constantly on the move.
So when you picture his kingdom, you can't just think of England.
No, not at all. You have to visualize this colossal thing called the Angevin Empire.
Let's talk about the scale of that for a second.
Mhm.
This wasn't just a few little holdings. This empire stretched from the borders of Scotland
All the way across the English Channel and then down through France.
to the Pyrenees Mountains, basically to the border of Spain.
It was a real anomaly in European history. And what's so fascinating is that Henry controlled more land in France than the King of France did.
Which must have been a little awkward.
I'd imagine so. He wasn't just King of England. He had these huge titles like Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou.
And crucially, through his wife, Duke of Aquitaine.
Right. And those titles brought him just massive wealth and resources.
Okay, I have to stop you. Running a territory that huge, and one that isn't even, all connected, that sounds like a complete logistical nightmare.
It was.
So how did he actually govern it? Or was he just constantly running from one rebellion to the next?
Well, that's the core challenge, and that's why he built such an innovative administration. To manage all that, Henry needed a really sophisticated, centralized government.
One that could get his orders out, collect taxes, enforce his laws.
Exactly, and across all these different cultures and languages.
So his need to be everywhere at once is what fueled the growth of this, administrative state.
Precisely. And all of that cost a fortune. The Angevin Empire was notoriously expensive to run, which meant high taxes.
And I'm guessing nobody was thrilled about that.
No. Those taxes funded the bureaucracy and the constant military campaigns to hold on to all that French land. It definitely created a lot of resentment.
But I guess there was an upside to controlling so much of the continent. I mean, it must have led to this huge exchange of culture and ideas.
Absolutely. It wasn't just troops crossing the channel. Think about the cultural flow. French became the language of the court and law in England for centuries.
You see it in architecture too, right?
You do. Gothic styles flowed back and forth. Noble families from England and the continent were intermarrying. The elite world became integrated in a way that really hadn't been seen since the Roman Empire.
Okay, so Henry builds this enormous, wealthy, and very complicated empire.
Yeah.
But if you want to find his real lasting legacy, the thing that still shapes our lives, you have to look at the law.
This is where he becomes truly revolutionary.
So what was the problem he was trying to fix?
Well, before Henry, justice was chaotic. It was deeply inconsistent. If you committed a crime, the rules really depended on whose land you were on.
So local barons and lords just made their own rules.
They did. Even the church had its own courts. It led to so much confusion and, frankly, a lot of unfairness.
It sounds like a recipe for instability. If you want to enforce order across this huge empire, you can't have a patchwork of local rules.
No, you need one king's peace. So Henry's solution was to introduce a centralized system of royal courts that applied the same law to everyone across the whole kingdom of England.
And this is the birth of what we call the English common law.
That's the very beginning of it, yes.
But how do you actually do that? How do you implement it across hundreds of miles? You can't just make an announcement and expect everyone to fall in line.
It was done through some very practical tools. One of the key ones was the writ.
A writ?
Yeah, it was a formal written order in the king's name. It told a royal official to do something, usually to move a case from a local court up to the king's court. It was like the key that unlocked the king's authority everywhere.
That makes perfect sense. The writ was the paperwork that carried the king's power.
He also set up this crucial system of traveling judges. They were called justices in air.
And these weren't just figureheads.
Not at all. They were highly trained legal experts who traveled in circuits all over the country, hearing cases and recording their decisions. This made sure that legal precedents were applied everywhere, making the king's justice feel very real, very present.
But by centralizing everything like that, wasn't Henry just grabbing an unprecedented amount of power for himself? Couldn't that system become tyrannical pretty easily?
That's a really fair point, and it leads to the next layer of his reforms,
Right.
public involvement. To make the whole system legitimate, Henry massively expanded the use of juries.
So these were groups of local people.
Usually 12 men, yeah. They were local, knowledgeable people who were called in to provide information or reach a verdict.
Ah, so he wasn't just forcing justice on people from the top down. He was building a system that actually required local participation.
Exactly. And these reforms were so effective, so logical, that they stuck around long after his dynasty was gone. They formed the very foundation of legal systems in the English-speaking world, including here in the U.S. That idea of one universal law, not just local custom, is Henry's permanent gift.
Now, you can't talk about a ruler who grabbed that much power without talking about serious conflict. And Henry's reign is defined by high-stakes drama.
Oh, absolutely, especially with two massive figures, Thomas Becket and Eleanor of Aquitaine.
Let's start with Becket. This is the man who went from friend to bitter rival.
It's such a tragedy, and it started as this great friendship. Henry needed to control the church. It was like its own government with its own lands, its own courts.
So he appoints his close personal friend, Thomas Becket, to be the Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest religious job in England.
Right, thinking my friend will side with me on everything.
And that plan backfired immediately.
Completely. The moment Becket was consecrated, he became this fierce defender of the church's authority. He believed it was totally separate from the king's law and even superior to it.
So the core conflict was about jurisdiction, right?
Yeah.
Who gets to try who?
It was. Henry insisted that priests who committed serious crimes, like murder, should be tried in his royal courts like anyone else.
And Becket said no.
Becket said only the church's courts, which were much more lenient, could judge the clergy. It was this huge battle over who had the final say in England.
This tension just got worse and worse, and it led to one of the most shocking events of the whole era.
It did. In 1170, 4 of Henry's knights, who probably overheard the king ranting in frustration about Becket,
They rode to Canterbury.
and they murdered him right inside Canterbury Cathedral.
The shockwave from that must have been immense.
It was. Henry seems to have been genuinely horrified, both by the murder itself and by the political fallout. To avoid being excommunicated by the Pope or even facing an invasion, he had to perform this really humiliating public penance.
He walked barefoot into Canterbury and let the monks scourge him.
He did. And that act cemented Becket as a martyr and a saint, and it ultimately forced Henry to give some power back to the church.
But the drama wasn't just with the church. It was right inside his own house with his wife.
We have to talk about Eleanor of Aquitaine.
An incredible figure.
Her marriage to Henry was the political deal of the century. She was wealthy, highly educated, and she'd already been the Queen of France before she married Henry.
And she brought the ultimate wedding gift. A massive territory of Aquitaine in southwestern France.
Which instantly made Henry the dominant power in the region and basically completed his Angevin Empire.
And she was a force in her own right, culturally. She established this famous court that supported poets and musicians.
A whole literature of courtly love. It was a real intellectual and artistic center, a world away from the battlefield.
But despite all the power their marriage created, their relationship just soured completely.
It really did. Eleanor came to see Henry as controlling, and eventually she did the unthinkable. She supported their sons, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, in a series of rebellions against their own father.
And that betrayal cost her. Big time.
It did. Henry imprisoned her for many years as punishment. But even in confinement, she remained this major political figure. She outlived Henry and played a huge role in the reigns of their sons, Richard the Lionheart and John.
So moving away from all that family drama, let's look at how Henry reformed his armies. Because these problems, with Becket and his own sons, they must have influenced his military thinking.
Oh, absolutely. He needed troops he could rely on. The traditional way of raising an army, the feudal system.
That's where the king calls on his barons, and they have to provide knights for, 40 days a year?
Exactly. But it was so unstable. If a baron was angry with you, or if a war was unpopular, your army could just disappear.
Which is not ideal when you're trying to descend an empire stretching 1,000 miles.
Deeply unreliable. So Henry introduced something called scutage, or shield money.
Okay.
It was a simple idea with a huge impact. He allowed barons to pay a fee to him instead of performing their military service.
So they take cash, and Henry uses that money to hire his own professional soldiers.
Exactly. He hired mercenaries, professional soldiers who were loyal to the person paying them, the king, not to some local noble. It drastically reduced his dependence on the barons and gave him a standing army that could fight year-round.
And he also built up defenses, right? Castles.
He did. He funded the construction and strengthening of massive stone castles, which were both military bases and, administrative centers for his government on the move.
And what was warfare actually like then? What were these knights using?
The knight was the ultimate weapon of the era. They wore heavy chainmail, maybe that's some early plate armor, and they rode these huge war horses called destriers, probably around 15 hands high, bred for charging. It was a very expensive, specialized way to fight.
So if we zoom out from the knights to, well, everyone else, we're back to that rigid feudal system.
We are. For the vast majority of people, society was this strict hierarchy. King at the top, then barons, then knights, and at the bottom, the peasants or serfs.
And we should be clear, these were the people who worked the land, and they were often legally tied to it. They had very few rights.
Their whole lives revolved around the farming calendar and, maybe even more importantly, religion. Religion was the absolute bedrock of society. The entire year was structured by religious festivals.
And the peasants paid taxes in crops or money to support both the church and the king's armies.
That's right. And since, 90% of the population was rural, agriculture was the foundation of Henry's entire economy.
They were using these heavy wooden plows pulled by teams of oxen.
And they had sophisticated ways to keep the land fertile. The three-field system was common.
Right, so you plant one field with wheat, another with something like oats, and you leave the third one fallow, unplanted, to let it recover.
It was essential science for survival. But at the same time, under Henry, towns started to grow bigger and more prosperous. This created a whole new social layer.
And towns could get special charters, right, to hold markets and govern themselves.
Yeah, which gave their citizens way more freedom than life on a manor. And trade was booming. The biggest export by far was English wool. It brought incredible wealth into the kingdom.
And inside these growing towns, you had craftsmen forming guilds.
These were associations that regulated the quality of their work, they trained apprentices, and they protected their members. They were becoming these new economic and political forces.
This shift wasn't just economic, though. Henry's time, the 12th century, it was a period of huge intellectual growth. People call it the 12th century Renaissance.
They do. It was during this time that you see schools starting to organize into what we'd recognize as universities. Oxford especially became this major center for study, drawing scholars from all over Europe.
And what were they studying?
The curriculum focused on the trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, the essential skills you'd need for a career in the church or, increasingly, in Henry's expanding royal government.
And these educated people were the ones who could manage his new legal system, the writs, the tax records.
Absolutely. Books were still handwritten by monks, so they were rare and valuable. And the universal language of all this education was Latin, which meant a scholar from England could easily communicate with one from Italy.
But for all his success, for all this innovation, Henry's final years were just consumed by the problems his own power had created.
He had these 4 ambitious sons. He tried to plan out how to divide the empire between them, but he refused to give them any real power while he was alive.
He even crowned his oldest son, Henry the Young King, as a co-ruler. But it was an empty title.
It was meaningless without actual authority, and this led to these major destructive family wars. His sons repeatedly teamed up with the King of France against their own father.
It's just cycles of betrayal and instability that plagued him right to the end.
Henry spent his final years fighting to keep his own empire from collapsing under the weight of his own family's ambition. He died in 1189, just physically and emotionally exhausted.
So when you sum it all up, what does it mean? When Henry II died, his massive Angevin Empire was already fractured, and it would eventually break apart.
It would. But the Kingdom of England itself was fundamentally transformed.
He left behind a dramatically better organized state.
He really did. He's remembered, and rightly so, as one of the most effective and hardworking kings in English history. His legacy of centralized government, especially through the common law, brought unnecessary stability to a very violent time. He and Eleanor were even buried together at Fontevraud Abbey in France, a monument to that incredibly powerful, volatile union.
Henry II built an enormous temporary empire. But his permanent achievement was fundamentally changing how justice works in England, setting up a legal system that defined the future of governance for centuries. He centralized power to an unprecedented degree. But by introducing a uniform, written system of law, did he unintentionally pave the way for the ultimate check on royal authority, the idea that even the king must eventually answer to the law, a concept that would challenge his son John just a few decades later with the Magna Carta. Think about that for a moment. See you next time.